Welcome to the weekly podcast of First United Methodist Church in Costa Mesa, California. Founded in 1912, the church gathers on Sundays at 10 a.m., and we invite you to join us anytime. For more information, visit our website, costamesafirst.umc.com, or connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter.
So we obviously messed with your stuff, didn't we? Move things around. Theo seems very upset about this, right? We moved things around a little bit so that we would face each other. And we've done that intentionally because we are starting a series on a life of intention. And how sometimes it's easy for things to just be the same old, right? So when it comes to faith, when it comes to even showing up at church, what's the first reaction? Well, that's my pew, so that's what I always do. And sometimes we just do things. And we do things without really having an intention behind it. But what happens is, what we can miss out on it is growth. If we're just doing it to do it again and again, and we kind of don't mix it up a little, right? We lose out on growth. Think about the relationships in your life, from friends to all those weird interactions that David mentioned earlier. However you are related to someone, whether it is that you are deeply known or you don't know each other very well, if you stop doing things intentionally and you just sort of, well, it's Friday, we always go to the movies on Friday, you lose some of the connection. And yet, there are things that we do that are patterns or rhythms, intentions, I would say, that actually grow us deeper to each other. So I have dear friends who always have a date night once a week. They have 4 children, and so it's incredible that they do that, but they do that intentionally so that they can communicate together. Now, we do church a little bit differently than a lot of folks who grew up in more, let's say, evangelical settings, right? So in an evangelical church, what happens is that you have usually 3 songs, right? There's usually 3 songs. And then at the end of 3 songs, there is a prayer of some sort, and then a pastor will come up usually, or someone will give announcements, and then a pastor comes up and preaches for about 45 minutes, right? And you're like, she moved our pews. Is she going to preach for 45 minutes? No, that I'm not going to do. But usually at the end of that, there will be a song that will cause you to reflect, and then they may or may not have time for you to go and have communion, or you might give your offering, whatever it might be, right? So who grew up in a church that was more kind of that sort of structure? Okay. And what's really interesting is my brothers and sisters, most often brothers, when I'm talking to the pastors of these churches, they'll say things like, well, we don't have liturgy. And if you know what liturgy is the work of the people or the structure with which we do things. And oftentimes what's most jarring to people when they come into this community is like the liturgy, the work of the people, or the way that we structure and do things, right? And so a pastor only has 15 to 20 minutes to preach, right? There's all this stuff going on, and it's not centrally focused on the sermon necessarily. Instead, there's something that the community, the gathered body, is doing together. It's intentionally done that way. And in some ways, we do the same thing over and over again, but it's really with the intention of having it become part of who we are. So we intentionally greet one another. That's for some folks, that is like their least favorite part of hall of worship. But then for some folks, it's the most important part, because they discover that in their day-to-day lives, they're not having moments where you say hi to each other unless you're like me and go to Trader Joe's when you're lonely, right? No one else does that. It's like my favorite place. I'm pretty sure I'm dating one of the guys that works there. He just doesn't know it yet. But, I'm always going there because they're so willing to greet you and be present. And so the greeting section might be the part, or maybe it's the prayers of the people. When I first started here, I took my first Sunday I had off in a long time, and I went away and I invited someone to come in to preach. And I don't know if you remember, but he thought he was doing me a favor, for those of you who've been here for a while, by telling you guys that things were going to change around here. And you were like, no kidding, we've met our pastor, we get that things are going to change. And one of the things he said is like, you probably won't be doing the prayers of the people, because that's just insular and nobody wants to hear everybody's problem. And he said, I did you a favor. And I said, yeah, but no, we're keeping that. And we do that intentionally as we are growing as a community, I mean, it's a question that we'll ask whether we have that time in service, but every time I've stopped and asked people, what's your favorite part of the service? Again and again, people say, the prayers of the people. The moment when I actually know what my brother or sister is going through, it is a powerful moment, and we intentionally do that prayer together. For some folks who have said, I don't know how to pray really anymore, but for something bold and wonderful about being able to pray in those moments together. Now, no one has said their favorite part of worship is offering. We'll have to jazz that up. But they have said that they love those moments when the offering is being taken up and Daniel or maybe even the whole band, Quentin, and maybe they're playing. There's something powerful in that moment. So we intentionally have a structure to worship. And what's really interesting is our tradition, who we are a church that is meant to be central around the theology of the table. What do I mean by that? Not this actual table, but it was funny. We rolled this in and someone said to me, what do you call that? And I was like, an altar. And they're like, oh, right. All right. We have this altar that we have up there often. And you guys every week must wonder what kind of shoes Daniel's wearing because he hides back there. So now Daniel, got to keep your fashion game up because we're going to see you every week. But up there is this altar. And you may or may not notice, or it might kind of just fade into the background up there, but it is central on the stage. Again, when I first got here and I was inviting people to come and lead worship, my friends were like, can you move that table so our band can get in? And I said, no. The whole point of church is that table. There is something about this meal, this communion meal that we take together. I have a question for you. How many of you eat dinner with your significant other or someone else? If you eat dinner every day with someone, raise your hand. I like how you checked out to make sure. Do we eat together? Friends, a new statistic recently came out that only 40 to 50% of families eat together. Now, I grew up in a home that was quite busy. My father was a physician. My mom was a nurse. We were crazy and involved in all the sports. And we had this important deal that we all ate dinner together, which might mean that we were all standing and throwing food in our mouths in the same room. But my mom, for her, it was really important that no matter what was going on, we were eating dinner together. Because that was the moment that we would connect. And it became kind of an odd thing where in our neighborhood, our house was kind of down at the bottom of a neighborhood. There was just a lake, which by the way, in the winter, my dad turned into it. Are you guys seeing the Norman Rockwell-ness of this? My dad turned the lake into a hockey rink. Did anyone hear in the news that during the polar vortex, there was this huge traffic jam? Did you hear about this? In Canada, this is true. There was a traffic jam in Montreal, and they realized it was going to take so long, and a hockey game broke out. That is the most Canadian thing I have ever heard. Think about that. There was enough extra hockey equipment that at any moment a hockey game could break out. And they have pictures of it. And they're like, oh yeah, we were stuck in traffic, so we just got together and started playing hockey instead of getting mad at each other. And I'm like, well, that is mad, but all right. That's how we got rid of things. So we had this house that everybody always gathered at. And what was really interesting, and I don't know if we ever noticed, but people always did it around meal times. Friends would pour from the neighborhood at meal times. And I started to notice that my brother's friends were coming at dinner time. And I'd always be like, Jonathan's not here. And they're like, yeah, we know. But they would come because at dinner time, our family would talk to each other. We have sort of a more European background, and meals are ones where you take a long time, right? We eat quickly, and then we just sit for hours, and we talk about life, and we connect. And that's what's happening here in this story that we hear from Luke, this intentional time that Jesus has set apart. And I think if we look at this pattern, how Jesus sets the meal up, what he says about the meal is really important if we're going to be intentional about living a life of faith. Our lives have to be based around the table. Now, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by our lives need to be based around the table? Well, I want us to notice that when they had the meal together, they were all together. They were all together, which is interesting because within tradition in that area, those who were the least most often were not at the head table. They would have been stratified based on who they were in society. But all of the disciples are here at this table. It's really interesting that even some artists have suggested by the way that they've done artwork, and it's fun to look up, that perhaps there were even women at the table. Shocking. Together, eating, sharing, and hearing these last words, these moments where Jesus is kind of giving his farewell address, is around a table where everyone is to be served. And later on in Acts, we'll discover that like the church messes this up. Right? The church messes this whole thing up. And even though Jesus said, like, I want you guys to all eat together, do this in remembrance of me, they start splitting people up. So in Acts, there's this whole thing where he says, everyone together, whoever you are don't some get served and others don't get served. No, all together. There is something about us all being together here at this table. I also want us to notice something that is so important and so key, is that Judas is in the room. Judas is in the room. Jesus says the meal is important. And then says, Judas, the one who has betrayed me, is here. We are not meant to decide who can and cannot be at this table. And I hate that because I don't want to go this week to hang out with people that make me really uncomfortable. I don't want to eat a meal with people who hurt my friends. I don't want to do that. And yet, this table makes me be intentional about making space for people. And for taking up space at a table when I am invited and others are not, because maybe I can sit for them. And if we are not together at this table, if we don't come together at this table, we are just yelling at each other from across the room. There's something about this table. It's interesting. When we look at even what the word means. When we talk about Eucharist, right? Have you heard the word Eucharist? So this is either called the Lord's Supper, right? Communion, or Eucharist. Eucharist really means thanksgiving. And if you look in a United Methodist hymnal, which I'm sure all of you just read at night, but if you look in a United Methodist hymnal, the Book of Discipline is also super great nighttime reading. But if you look, you'll see that this is called the Great Thanksgiving. Even the words that we say around this meal and the way that they have tried to lay it out, it is a reminder to do this in remembrance of me. Have a meal in remembrance of me. And in fact, early Methodism, if you don't know, you walked into a Methodist church, you're all like, we don't know what we walked into today. But when you came in, you intentionally came into a Methodist church, whether you knew it or not. And a Methodist church has some interesting theology around communion, or the Lord's Supper. You'll notice we take it together. Nobody goes off in a corner. I've shared before, I used to attend a non-denominational church. I was a fully ordained clergy member, but I would attend a non-denominational church, and I have to admit it's because I loved the music and the boys with beards. So I would go to this really cool, hip church because it was just great. And it was always really funny, and I've now become friends with one of the lead pastors, and we joke around that I was like an incognito member of the community. I would serve as a barista. Mind you, I already had a Master's of Divinity from Duke, but I felt like in that space, I just kind of wanted to be an undercover pastor. I don't know what that was, but there it was. And so I used to, when we would they offered a time for communion every week. And it was in a corner, in a darkened corner, and then just you and Jesus could have a meal together. And it always just sat with me weird. Why would you just have a meal? That seems like that's not, and I think as I've processed this is because we're not meant to take this meal alone. This do in remembrance of me, be present to others. When we take the meal alone, and I know what you're thinking, yes, I would go through the entire liturgy in my mind when I took communion there. So you imagine I held up the line because I'm like, the peace of the Lord be with you and also with you, but it was just me, no one else. It's also really funny, I was at a conference last weekend speaking to all those youth, and there were a bunch of pastors, and the bishop of that area came and did communion. And you have to understand, this is about a 6'2" black guy. He's he's so profound. It just has this, and he was doing communion, and all of the pastors in the back, we were all saying the wrong parts. So in a moment when we do the liturgy, there will be a part that the community says, and there's a part that the pastor says. But when you're so used to being the pastor, we were saying the wrong parts. But when we caught up and we joined in, it was interesting how profound it was for us to just receive communion. Not to have to be the one to give it out, but to receive it. What I also want us to notice about this table, if we're being intentional about taking this meal, if we're being intentional about seeing our lives patterned after the table, what you'll notice within our tradition is that everyone is welcome at the table. Everyone. You don't have to be a member of this church or a member of any church. You don't even have to, it's just basically, you might just be like, maybe this Jesus guy? And that's very different. Particularly for the history of when this was happening. You know, people were banned from communion. It was like, if you were bad, you couldn't come have communion. Our founder banned his ex-girlfriend. That's my favorite story about him, from communion. There were value to being able to come and take communion. And so it's very different to have a church that says, no, it's not up to me to say you are able to have this meal. Again, remember, even Judas was in the room. The other thing I kind of love and really freaks out germaphobes is we hand you the piece of bread. We do this thing called intinction. It's always fun for people who are new to this sort of community that you have to dip the bread in, right? And then there's always the people who already put it in their mouth, and then they think, do I take it out of my mouth and dip it in? You guys should serve communion. It's really fun to see the psychology of people. I got it wrong, or they don't know what to do. I had that awkward moment where the bishop last weekend gave me a chunk like this, and so I was choking on Jesus. It was it's a lot of Jesus. And I noticed he gave the other pastor a smaller piece, which makes me think he thinks I needed more Jesus than he did. But as we give this, why do we give this? Well, we give the bread as a reminder that grace is not something you have to work for or take. It is simply given. So if we think about the intention of this table and the meaning of this table, we are reminded that our life, if it's going to be intentionally patterned after this rhythm, then all are welcome, whether we think they deserve it or not. That grace is something that we are given, not something that we can take. But we're also told, this do in remembrance of me. I think that's important because it's not this be and it's not this say, right? When we think about a faith, an intentional faith, it's about what we do, our actions. It's how we live this thing out. You know, there is an old hymn, for they will know we are Christians by our love. Many of us walk around thinking, well, they'll know we are Christians by our snazzy t-shirts that let people know. Or we'll know we are Christians by the way that I judge you excessively, right? If we pattern and are intentional about even our meals and who we're eating with and who we're inviting into this space, it can transform our whole faith. I'm often challenged by this table because sometimes I don't like it that anyone can come. Sometimes I don't like that I have to, again, be present to people in the way of having a meal, right? There's nothing more awkward. In fact, the other night I was out to dinner with my friend, and I ran into my other friends, and then we were next to a first-time Bumble date. And if you don't know what that is, it's an app, right? And so it was clear that they were on a first date. And unfortunately, as a pastor and just as a generally creepy person, sometimes I listen when people are talking loudly. And so they're next to us, and they're having this awkward conversation. And so I comment oh my gosh, this is the first date. And my friend says, bold, who would go to a meal? You can't just leave. And I was like, noted. But right? There is a commitment to having a meal together. A commitment. Friends, as we are intentional about our faith, as we talk about the different things that sort of transform us, we come to the table to be reminded of who and whose we are. There was a big altar like this when I was in graduate school. And I always am in the place where they like rebuild while I'm there. So I don't know what that says about me, but they were rebuilding this building. And so we would have class. Our biggest classes would be in the chapel. And we had these boards that we'd have to use and sit and write on and use our computers on. But it meant that when we turned our tests in, we turned them in on the altar. No pressure, right? But I remember my friend pointing out to us once that, wow, when we turn our papers in, it says, "This do in remembrance of me." And how even the work that we were doing, the difficult tasks sometimes of that education was a pattern of doing it in remembrance of who Jesus is. It is a tangible reminder every time we take the meal that our lives are to be patterned in this way. I can't wait for this series, by the way. I love that you guys are facing each other. I think that is incredible because there is an opportunity for us to see each other in a different way. And I'm laughing because I think those back 4 pews, you guys are just going to keep filling in because that's your like comfort zone back there. So I might mix things up. Y'all don't know. I'm just kidding. I can't actually physically move those. But what is it going to be like for us to be intentional for the next 4 weeks around the ways that we do things? Next week, we're going to have a little activity in prayer. I'm so excited. Daniel Pappas and Allison, his girlfriend, they have created a prayer experience for us here in this space. It's going to be amazing. We've got all kinds of things going on, but each week I'm going to challenge you. So this week, as we get ready to take communion together, I want to challenge you this week to either have if you can't quite commit to it, have a cup of coffee, if that's easier, or have a snack with someone, or have a meal with someone where you are intentionally present. What does that look like? It means like maybe don't have our stuff with us, maybe look them in the eye. That's not something we do very much anymore. Just be present to them in that meal. And then next week we're going to talk about what that means.